Michael Jordan learns his favorite high school teacher needs help. His next move changes everything. The drive back to Wilmington was always nostalgic for Michael Jordan. It had been years since he'd returned to his high school, but every time he passed through the familiar streets of his hometown, memories flooded his mind, of simpler times, of struggles, and of the people who helped him become the man he was today. Now, with a schedule packed with business meetings, charity events, and family commitments, he found little time to visit his roots. But something pulled him back to St. Vincent St. Mary High School today. It wasn't for an official event. It wasn't for any special occasion, just a quiet visit to reflect on where it all began. As Michael pulled into the parking lot, he noticed the familiar brick building, the gymnasium where he had spent countless hours perfecting his jump shot, and the fields where the echoes of games and practices still seemed to linger in the air. But there was one place he hadn't thought about in a while: the classroom. Michael's thoughts turned to his high school teacher, Mr. Thompson. A name that had been etched in his memories since his teenage years. He wasn't one of the flashy teachers, the ones who would make a dramatic impact with grand gestures. No, Mr. Thompson had been quiet, unassuming, and humble, but his lessons had stuck with Michael in ways he hadn't understood at the time. The small, wiry figure of Mr. Thompson had always been there for Michael when the pressure of basketball and life became overwhelming. Whether it was a brief chat after class, or a note of encouragement when Michael doubted his future, Mr. Thompson had always offered support. He was the teacher who made Michael believe that the strength to succeed wasn't just about talent, but about perseverance, discipline, and character. As Michael walked toward the school's entrance, he couldn't help but smile at the memories. The hallways were different, but in some ways, they felt the same. The lockers, the classrooms, everything had changed, but nothing had really changed. The familiar smell of paper and chalk was still in the air. He was here for a personal reason this time, though. His trip had been planned for reflection, for gratitude, but when he thought of Mr. Thompson, he found himself hoping to reconnect, even if just for a moment. Walking through the front doors, Michael made his way toward the teacher's lounge. As he passed the classrooms, he could hear the hum of activity, students laughing, the sound of lessons being taught, the voices of teachers guiding the next generation of young minds. When he reached the lounge, he knocked gently on the door, expecting to see some familiar faces of old staff members. But instead, it was a new face that greeted him, a young teacher in her mid-30s. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked politely. Michael smiled, taking off his jacket. "I'm looking for Mr. Thompson. Is he around?" The young teacher paused, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to slight confusion. "Mr. Thompson? You mean Mr. Thompson, the history teacher?" "Yes," Michael replied, his voice softening with a sense of nostalgia. "He taught me back in the day. Is he still here?" There was a brief silence before the teacher spoke again, this time more hesitantly. "Actually, Mr. Thompson retired a few years ago. He comes by every now and then to visit, but he hasn't been doing too well lately. He's been dealing with some health issues, and I'm not sure if he's around today." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Thompson, the man who had been such a quiet, steady presence in his life, had retired. The news hit Michael harder than he expected. He hadn't known about his health problems, hadn't kept in touch in the way he should have. Guilt and concern rushed through him. "Do you know where I can find him?" "I'd really like to see him," Michael asked, his voice gentle but firm. The teacher nodded, pulling out a piece of paper from her desk. "He lives just a few miles away, actually. I think he's home today, recovering from a surgery. I can give you the address if you'd like to visit." Michael thanked her and took the address, making a mental note of it as he turned to leave the lounge. The brief interaction left him unsettled. The idea that Mr. Thompson was struggling with his health and that he hadn't reached out felt wrong. He had been such a significant part of Michael's formative years, and Michael hadn't even thought to check in. His mind raced as he thought about what he could do to help. On the drive to Mr. Thompson's house, Michael's thoughts turned to the man who had guided him through some of his toughest years. He thought about the quiet encouragement he had given him when everything seemed uncertain. He thought about how Mr. Thompson had always believed in him, even when Michael didn't believe in himself. And as he turned onto the street where Mr. Thompson lived, a new sense of determination settled over him. Michael wasn't just going to show up with a quick visit, he was going to do something that would truly make a difference, something that would change the trajectory of Mr. Thompson's life. Pulling into the driveway of a modest house, Michael sat for a moment, taking in the sight. It wasn't grand, but it had that warm, familiar feeling of home. The house looked well kept, the front yard small but tidy, with a couple of flower beds bordering the driveway. It was the kind of place that felt lived in, where memories were made, where love and care had been poured into every corner. As Michael knocked on the door, he felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. He wasn't sure what he would find on the other side, but he knew this was the right thing to do. The door creaked open slowly, and there he was, Mr. Thompson, a little grayer, a little older, but with the same warm smile that had made him such a comforting presence in Michael's life. "Well, I'll be Michael Jordan, as I live and breathe," Mr. Thompson said, his voice a little raspy but full of warmth. "Come on in, son. It's been a long time." As Michael stepped inside, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He had come back to see his teacher, but this time, he was going to do more than just offer a handshake or a few kind words. This time, he was going to change Mr. Thompson's life in a way that would honor everything he had given to him and so many others. Michael stepped into the modest living room of Mr. Thompson's home, the familiar surroundings evoking memories of simpler times. The room was filled with old bookshelves lined with dusty volumes, a few family photos on the walls, and an antique armchair that had seen better days. It was a far cry from the polished halls of the schools and stadiums Michael was used to. But it had a warmth to it, a feeling of history, of someone who had dedicated their life to others, even if it was in quieter, less public ways. "Take a seat, Michael," Mr. Thompson said, gesturing toward the worn but comfortable couch across from his armchair. His voice was soft, tinged with the weariness of someone who had faced his share of battles. But his smile was still present, the same reassuring grin that had made him such a beloved teacher. Michael sat down, his eyes scanning the room, searching for a way to begin. His heart was heavy, the weight of seeing his old mentor like this pulling at him. He had always known that Mr. Thompson had sacrificed much for his students, but the reality of what he was now facing was more than Michael had expected. "So, what's been going on, Mr. Thompson?" Michael asked, leaning forward slightly. His voice was filled with genuine concern. Mr. Thompson settled into his chair, the deep sigh he gave a sign of the exhaustion that seemed to hang over him. "Well, Michael, you know how it is. Getting older isn't as glamorous as they make it seem." He chuckled softly, but it was clear the laugh didn't come easily. "I've had a few health problems lately, nothing too serious, but enough to slow me down. And with that, everything else kind of falls apart, you know?" Michael nodded, his brow furrowing. "What kind of problems?" Mr. Thompson paused, glancing out the window as if searching for the right words. "Well, I've got some arthritis in my knees, and my back hasn't been the same since I had that surgery a few years ago. It makes getting around a little tougher. And then there's the cost of medicine. You know, when you're on a fixed income, those things pile up quickly." Michael's stomach tightened. He had heard stories of how difficult it could be for retired teachers to make ends meet, especially when they didn't have the luxury of big pensions or benefits. But hearing it from Mr. Thompson, someone who had been such a steady presence in his life, made it feel all the more personal. "And financially?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Thompson's face tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've always lived simply. I didn't want much, Michael. But after I retired, it's been tough to keep up. The cost of living keeps rising, and my savings aren't what they used to be. I had to dip into them just to pay for the medical bills. I've been getting by, but there's only so much I can do on my own. I hate asking for help, always have, but, well, it's getting harder to manage." Michael felt a pang of guilt, hearing how Mr. Thompson, who had poured so much of himself into his students, was now struggling in silence. It stung him deeply to think that someone who had dedicated their life to teaching and helping others was now facing such difficulties in his later years. "Mr. Thompson," Michael said softly, his voice laced with emotion, "you've done so much for me. I can't even begin to explain how much I appreciate everything you've done, how much it shaped me. You were always there for me when I was trying to figure out who I was, even when things weren't easy. And now, you shouldn't have to go through this." Mr. Thompson raised his hand to stop him, a gentle, almost apologetic look on his face. "Michael, I didn't do it for any recognition. I did it because I believed in you. I wanted to see you succeed, not just as a basketball player, but as a person. That's what matters in the end." Michael's chest tightened as he processed Mr. Thompson's words. The man had given him more than just academic knowledge. He had given him life lessons, guidance, and belief when no one else seemed to have it. And now, here he was, facing a difficult reality that Michael couldn't ignore. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," Michael said again, his voice firm with determination. "You've given so much to everyone around you. It's time for me to help you." Mr. Thompson's eyes softened, and he shook his head slightly, as though he couldn't quite accept what Michael was offering. "You don't owe me anything, Michael. You've already done more than enough. You've had an incredible career. That's all the thanks I need." Michael shook his head. "No. You've been there for me, for so many of us. I can't just walk away from this knowing you're still struggling. I'm going to help. I'm not going to let you go through this alone." The conversation had taken a turn that Michael hadn't anticipated. He had come here with a desire to reconnect, to show appreciation, but now, it had become something much more important. It had become clear that he had the ability to change Mr. Thompson's life, to provide him with the peace and comfort that he so richly deserved after a lifetime of service. "I'm going to take care of you, Mr. Thompson," Michael said resolutely, standing up. "I'm going to make sure you don't have to worry about anything anymore." Mr. Thompson looked at Michael with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I don't know what to say. I never thought anyone would do something like this for me." "You don't have to say anything," Michael said, his voice softening. "It's the least I can do for everything you've done for me. I'm going to make sure you can retire with peace of mind. I'll take care of the medical bills, the retirement funds, everything. You've earned it." Tears welled up in Mr. Thompson's eyes as he looked at Michael, unable to find the words to express the gratitude he felt. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of relief, a sense of hope that had long been absent. The conversation with Mr. Thompson weighed heavily on Michael's mind as he left the teacher's house. His heart ached for the man who had given so much of himself to help others, only to find himself struggling in his later years. Michael had always known that Mr. Thompson had been an important part of his life, but hearing about the health problems, the financial strain, and the sacrifices he had made gave him a new understanding of just how much Mr. Thompson had been holding together on his own for so long. As Michael sat in his car, parked in front of Mr. Thompson's house, he couldn't help but think back to his high school days. Mr. Thompson had been the steady presence in his life, especially when everything around him seemed to be in chaos. Michael remembered how Mr. Thompson had stayed after class, offering advice when his world felt too overwhelming. He remembered the way Mr. Thompson spoke to him, not as a student, but as someone who mattered, someone worth listening to. But now, Michael thought, Mr. Thompson was the one who needed help. Michael's phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was Maverick, his business partner and lifelong friend. "Hey, Mike, you good? I heard you went to see Mr. Thompson today." LeBron smiled at the concern in Maverick's voice. "Yeah, I'm good. Just, spent some time with him. He's not doing well, man." Maverick's voice turned serious. "What's going on? Is he all right?" Michael let out a deep breath, the weight of the conversation with Mr. Thompson coming back to him. "He's not doing all right, Mav. He's struggling. His health is getting worse, and financially, he's in a tough spot. I can't believe I never knew. Yeah, sounds rough, Maverick replied, his voice full of understanding. So what's the plan? Michael paused for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do to help. I don't know yet. But I do know one thing, I'm not just going to let him suffer. He's been there for me, for so many others. It's time I show up for him. Maverick was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what Michael was saying. You're right. You've got the resources to make a real difference in his life. And he deserves it, Mike. You can't change the past, but you can certainly help him now. Michael nodded to himself, his decision solidifying in his mind. I'm going to take care of him, Maverick. I'm not going to let him struggle anymore. I'm going to make sure he has the peace he deserves after all these years of giving to others. Maverick's voice turned encouraging. I've got your back on this, Mike. Let me know how I can help. You know I'm in. The conversation ended, and Michael sat for a moment in silence. The weight of his decision felt enormous, but it was also incredibly clear. Mr. Thompson had shaped Michael into the man he was today, not just as a player, but as a person. Now, it was time to give back, to offer something that would truly change Mr. Thompson's life. LeBron had always believed in giving back, and using his platform to make a difference, but this was more personal. This was not just about a donation or a sponsorship, it was about showing someone who had dedicated their life to others that they were seen, that they were valued, and that they mattered. The next day, Michael set up a meeting with his financial advisors and a few people from his charity team. He explained the situation, detailing Mr. Thompson's struggles, and then he outlined his plan. He wanted to set up a financial safety net for Mr. Thompson, enough for him to retire with dignity, to cover his medical expenses, and to make sure he never had to worry about finances again. But more than that, Michael knew Mr. Thompson deserved recognition. He needed to be celebrated for all he had done, and Michael was going to make sure the world knew how much he had impacted so many lives. As the weeks went by, Michael's team worked diligently on securing the necessary resources. They established a retirement fund, a scholarship in Mr. Thompson's name to honor his legacy as an educator, and a healthcare plan that would ensure he had access to the best care available. They also planned a special community event, a gathering to honor Mr. Thompson, where former students and teachers could come together to share their stories and show their appreciation. Michael had never been this determined to do something, and as the day of the event approached, his excitement grew. He wasn't just helping a man who had been influential in his life, he was showing a community how one person's kindness could ripple out and change the lives of so many others. But it wasn't just the event that Michael was focused on, it was the personal impact he wanted to have on Mr. Thompson. Michael wanted him to understand that this wasn't just charity, it was a recognition of his years of selflessness, of how his belief in his students had created a legacy that would live on long after he retired. The day of the event arrived, and Michael was at the venue early, greeting old friends, teachers, and former students who had come to honor Mr. Thompson. The community gathered in the school's gymnasium, which had been transformed into a celebration of Mr. Thompson's life and work. There was a sense of warmth in the air, a shared appreciation for the man who had impacted so many lives. As people arrived, Michael took a moment to reflect on the life-changing decision he had made and the profound effect it would have on Mr. Thompson's future. And then, just before the event started, Michael saw Mr. Thompson walk into the room. The old teacher, now dressed in a suit, looking somewhat unsure but still exuding the same quiet strength, entered the space with a hesitant smile. Michael's heart swelled as he saw the man who had been his mentor for so many years. It was time. The gymnasium was filled with anticipation as the evening drew closer. Michael had seen the look on Mr. Thompson's face when he arrived, confusion mixed with a touch of nervousness, unsure of what the event was about. Michael's heart ached as he watched his old teacher move around the room, greeting familiar faces from years past. It was clear that Mr. Thompson had never expected anything like this. The room was filled with warmth, but there was a palpable sense of reverence in the air. Alumni who had passed through these halls, teachers who had worked alongside Mr. Thompson, and even students who had been inspired by his quiet yet profound wisdom all gathered together. The stage was set for something extraordinary, an event that would honor the life and work of a man who had spent decades shaping minds and supporting students like Michael. Michael stood at the front of the room, waiting for the moment when he would finally reveal the surprise he had been planning for weeks. As the crowd slowly quieted, his thoughts flashed back to his high school days. He remembered his early years at St. Vincent St. Mary, when everything was uncertain, when he wasn't sure where his path would lead. But through it all, there had been one constant, Mr. Thompson, guiding him, pushing him to be better, not just in basketball, but in life. He had given him something that no amount of fame or wealth could ever replace, a foundation of character, a belief in himself. It was time for Mr. Thompson to finally understand how much he had meant to Michael and to so many others. As the crowd fell silent, Michael stepped up to the podium. His heart was racing, but he knew this was a moment that would change everything for Mr. Thompson. He cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We're gathered here for one reason and one reason only, to honor a man whose influence reaches far beyond the classroom. A man who taught us more than just history or literature. He taught us about life, about perseverance, about believing in ourselves when no one else did. This man is my teacher, my mentor, and a friend, Mr. Thompson." The room erupted in applause, but Mr. Thompson stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly as he looked around at the people who had gathered in his honor. He seemed overwhelmed, unsure of how to respond. Michael smiled, his eyes meeting Mr. Thompson's across the room. "Mr. Thompson, I know you didn't do this work for recognition. You never asked for anything in return. But today, I'm asking you to accept this, because you've earned it more than anyone else I know." As the applause quieted, Michael turned to a nearby table where a large check was displayed on an easel. It wasn't just any check, it was a symbol of everything Michael had planned for Mr. Thompson. He walked over to the table, taking a moment before turning back to the crowd. "I've arranged for a retirement fund, one that will take care of you for the rest of your life. You don't have to worry about healthcare costs or financial struggles anymore, Mr. Thompson. You've given so much to all of us, and now it's time for you to enjoy the peace you deserve." Mr. Thompson's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the check. His eyes welled up with tears as the weight of what Michael was offering hit him. He had never expected anything like this. The reality of Michael's generosity was overwhelming. "And that's not all," Michael continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. "In addition to that, I've set up a scholarship in your name. The Mr. Thompson Scholarship will support students who want to follow in your footsteps, students who want to make a difference in the world, just like you did for all of us." The crowd stood and clapped, the recognition for Mr. Thompson echoing throughout the gymnasium. For a moment, it seemed as though time had slowed, and Mr. Thompson stood frozen, his hands pressed to his chest as the enormity of the gesture sank in. But then, Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on Mr. Thompson's shoulder. "You've always believed in me, Mr. Thompson. Now, it's my turn to show you how much you mean to me, and to everyone in this room. You gave us the foundation to succeed, and now we're here to give back to you." Mr. Thompson's face was a mixture of shock and overwhelming gratitude. His voice cracked as he spoke, the words barely escaping him. I don't know what to say. This is more than I could have ever imagined. I never asked for anything, Michael. I did it because I believed in you, in all of you. But this is beyond anything I could have dreamed." Tears streamed down Mr. Thompson's face as he looked around the room at the people who had come to honor him. The teachers, the students, the alumni, all of them gathered here to show their appreciation for the man who had shaped their lives. For the first time, Mr. Thompson truly understood the impact he had made. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the moment settling in. Michael could see how deeply this recognition was affecting Mr. Thompson. The man who had spent his life giving, who had never expected anything in return, was now standing in front of a community that had come together to honor him. "Thank you, Michael," Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice trembling. "You've changed my life. I never thought I would be in a room like this, surrounded by people who care. But because of you, I feel seen. I feel appreciated. Thank you." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You've given us so much, Mr. Thompson. It's an honor to give back to you." The applause erupted again, this time louder and longer. As Michael and Mr. Thompson stood together, surrounded by the people whose lives they had touched, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This moment was not just about giving money or gifts, it was about recognizing the true impact of someone's life, about honoring a man who had shaped the future of countless individuals. And as Mr. Thompson wiped his tears, his voice steadying, he turned to Michael, his gratitude evident. "You've made a difference, Michael. More than you'll ever know." The weeks following the community event were filled with a sense of change for both Michael and Mr. Thompson. For Michael, the satisfaction of knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life was deeply fulfilling. But for Mr. Thompson, everything had shifted. What had once been a quiet retirement filled with uncertainty and fear had transformed into a new beginning. The scholarship in his name was already making waves in the community, attracting attention from local students and teachers alike. And Michael's generous contributions had ensured that Mr. Thompson no longer had to worry about his financial future. For the first time in years, Mr. Thompson was able to breathe easy. Days after the event, Michael received a phone call from Mr. Thompson. His voice, once strained with worry and exhaustion, now carried a new lightness, a new sense of peace. "Michael," Mr. Thompson said, his voice filled with gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you. You've not only taken care of my financial worries, but you've given me a purpose again. That scholarship, it's not just a gift, it's a legacy. I can't tell you how much it means to see my name attached to something that will help students achieve their dreams." Michael leaned back in his chair, smiling as he listened to the words of his former teacher. "I'm glad to hear it, Mr. Thompson. You've earned that recognition and so much more. The way you shaped us, it's something that stays with us for a lifetime." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Mr. Thompson was processing the magnitude of the changes in his life. Then, he spoke again, his voice a little quieter. "Michael, I never wanted any of this. I didn't do it for the applause. But now, looking at everything that's happened, I realize something. You've shown me that, after all these years of giving, it's okay to receive. It's okay to let others care for you the way you've cared for them." Michael's throat tightened. Hearing Mr. Thompson speak like that, with such genuine humility, reminded him of why he'd made the decision to help. The teacher who had always put others first, who had never asked for anything in return, was now accepting the love and support he so rightfully deserved. "You've taught me more than you'll ever know, Michael," Mr. Thompson continued. "You've taught me that it's okay to lean on others, to allow myself to be taken care of. And for that, I will be forever grateful." The conversation ended, and Michael sat in quiet reflection. This had never been about accolades or public recognition. It was about showing gratitude to a man who had shaped his life when Michael was unsure of who he was or where he was going. And now, Michael had given him the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of a life spent giving, just as he had. As the weeks went on, Michael kept in touch with Mr. Thompson. He knew that life for his old teacher had irrevocably changed, but he also wanted to make sure that Mr. Thompson didn't feel like a charity case. The money and the scholarship were important, but Michael understood that the most meaningful change came from empowering someone to rediscover their own value and purpose. Mr. Thompson had done that for so many students, and now Michael had done it for him. One sunny afternoon, as Michael was leaving a meeting at his foundation's headquarters, he received another call from Mr. Thompson. This time, his voice was full of excitement. "Michael, you won't believe this. A few of the students from the scholarship program came to see me today. They wanted to meet the man behind the scholarship, the one who'd made it possible for them to pursue their dreams. They came in, and they were so excited. It made me feel like I was part of something important again, something bigger than myself." Michael smiled at the joy in Mr. Thompson's voice. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to feel proud, Mr. Thompson. You've changed those kids' lives just like you changed mine. The conversation continued, filled with stories of the students Mr. Thompson was mentoring now that he had more time to focus on the scholarship program. Michael could hear the passion in his voice as Mr. Thompson spoke about the young people he was helping, the way he was passing on the lessons he had taught for so many years. It was clear that the teacher who had quietly shaped the lives of countless students was now in a place where he could truly savor the impact of his legacy. One evening, Michael sat with his family at dinner, the weight of the past few months settling on him. He had been so focused on his career, on his brand, on the things that seemed important in the grand scheme of success. But now, after everything with Mr. Thompson, Michael realized what truly mattered: the people who helped shape us, the mentors who cared, the teachers who gave without asking for anything in return. "Mom, Dad," Michael said, glancing at his parents, "I think I want to do more of this. More than just supporting causes or giving money. I want to be someone who makes a difference in people's lives the way Mr. Thompson did for me. I've got the resources, but it's time to give back in ways that actually change people's futures." His mother smiled at him, her eyes full of pride. "You've always been a giver, Michael. You've always been the one to step up for those who need it. And I'm glad to see you doing it in a way that really honors the people who helped you." Michael nodded thoughtfully. It's time to create real change, not just on the basketball court, but in the world. Mr. Thompson taught me that. The rest of the evening passed with laughter and stories, but Michael's mind was already thinking about the future, about how he could expand his efforts, about how he could continue to pay it forward. Helping Mr. Thompson had changed everything for him. It had given him a new perspective on success and purpose. As he lay in bed later that night, Michael reflected on the journey he had taken to help his former teacher. It had started as a simple desire to give back, but it had turned into something more, a shift in how he viewed his role in the world. Mr. Thompson's gratitude and the joy he found in seeing his scholarship students thrive had opened Michael's eyes to the power of mentorship, generosity, and true impact. And as Michael closed his eyes, he knew that this was only the beginning. There was so much more he could do. So much more he would do.